Hey, you too.
Brad Olson, Persuasive Speech. Assisted suicide is a very controversial issue. In some cases, assisted suicide can be used in an evil way. In other cases, it can be used for sympathy. A person who has had a tragic event in their life might consider assisted suicide because they are depressed. Yes, I would argue that the person who is assisting in the suicide might be more similar to a murderer, especially if they did not try to cheer up the victim before helping them in the process of assisted suicide. There are many cases where people survive terrible accidents but have to suffer in the aftermath. Some do not even live through their suffering. People who lose their family in some accident and are injured in such a way that they may either die or never fully recover. People who suffer every day until their disease inevitably takes them. Why prolong their misery? I believe that cases of assisted suicide should help those who are suffering should be legalized. So why force them to suffer? There are many situations in which someone has gone beyond the point of recovery even with today's medicine. One such case is the story of Matthew Donnelly, found in Issues in Ethics, a magazine written by Santa Clara University. After years of working with x-rays, Matthew's body had begun to deteriorate. Doctors predicted that Matthew had a year to live. Matthew had already lost part of his jaw, 2 fingers on his right hand, his left hand, his nose, and his eyesight. And despite the use of medicine, he still felt extreme pain. And after repeated pleas to his family to end his life, Matthew's brother Harold could not stand to see his brother suffer anymore. And with a .30 caliber pistol, Harold ended Matthew's life. After that, Harold was charged with murder. Although I disagree with how Harold went about ending his brother's life, Matthew should have been given the option of assisted suicide. In such a case where someone such as Matthew is unable to recover and unable to live the remainder of their days as they see fit, and enduring extreme pain day in and day out until their inevitable death, the question is raised again, and why prolong their misery? Not only is the terminally ill person suffering, but their family suffers simply by watching them. Why force them to be lonely? In an article in The Guardian, Polly Toynbee wrote about the story of Tony Nicholson. Tony was originally a happy and normal person, a civil engineer who loved playing rugby and skydiving. That all changed one day. He had a stroke while on a business trip. As a result, he developed Lockton syndrome, a paralytic condition where you can only communicate or move through eye movement. The only way that people with Lockton syndrome can communicate with eye movements is through the use of special equipment. With this condition, it makes communicating with other people very difficult, and thus can make the patient feel isolated. Only by communicating with special equipment can the patient speak to those they love. At age 58, the doctors told Tony that he had potentially at least 20 more years to live. Tony was able to communicate to his family that he wished to have an assisted suicide, but the courts ruled that he was not allowed to have an assisted suicide. Being unable to move, and with communication being very difficult, the patients who reach this point start to feel like they have been stripped of their final right, their right to die. What about terminal diseases? There are many diseases and injuries that a person may never recover from. The term terminal illness defines illnesses that take a patient's life in a relatively short period of time, or illnesses that have a high probability of doing so. According to Easing Death, an article about The Economist newspaper, prior to 2011, only Washington and Oregon had passed physician-assisted suicide laws. In 2011, there was a very obvious liberal movement, with 6 states here voting to legalize physician-assisted suicide. Only one of the states, Idaho, failed to pass any legislation. This liberal movement has begun to ease people into the idea of being more accepting of allowing patients who are terminally ill to seek help in a suicide if they have grown too weak to commit suicide on their own. 7 countries and states have already begun to pass laws to allow terminally ill patients the option for assisted suicide. However, it should also be noted that we must take caution in opening up to the idea of assisted suicide. doing everything in our power to only allow the option to the terminally ill and those who are truly suffering. However, legalizing assisted suicide, how would legalizing assisted suicide affect depressed people who are thinking about suicide? Last year, an article titled "Assisted Dying Review Selects Those Who Could End Their Life" ran in England's newspaper, The Independent. The article looks at areas that have already legalized assisted suicide and how they go about determining who gets the right to die. The article determines that only a person suffering from a terminal illness who is likely to die within 12 months, is of sound mind, and has a settled intention to die should have choice of an assisted death, as well as those who are physically disabled. It is apparent that some conditions must be met before a person is considered eligible for assisted suicide. Returning to the question, how would legalizing assisted suicide affect depressed people who are thinking about suicide? Someone who is depressed and seeking a suicide would not qualify for the sound mind requirement, and making them ineligible for assisted suicide. To further attempt to dissuade patients from seeking assisted suicide, England's new regulations would require doctors to be sure that all other options for end-of-life care have been explained to the patient. How could you trust a doctor who killed someone with your life? In his Wall Street Journal article, "Please Take a Step Back from the Assisted Suicide Ledge," Tadeusz Hadcholowicz expresses his opinions on an issue of trust between patient and physician. An issue of trust may be formed if a patient believes that their physician may have had a hand in helping one of their previous patients take their life. Tadeusz relates physician-related suicide to a police-assisted suicide by pointing out police officers could supply a terminally ill patient with a gun. Many people would raise the question, would you want to put your life in the hands of someone who intentionally gave another patient a method to kill themselves? There are several ways around this, although they must be used carefully. Physicians must determine whether or not the patient has a chance of survival. A patient and their family must come to terms with the patient's condition, and then only if the patient has passed a series of checks may the patient be given the prescription for a lethal dose of pentobarbital, a pill that causes the patient to fall asleep or that they will die peacefully. The prescription is intentionally made in pill form to allow the patient to take it themselves, thus removing the physician from the situation, leaving the patient to decide to take the pill or not, making the final decision the patient's alone. So how would assisted suicide affect the patient's family? Most people would argue that the family would feel the same emotions as if the person had committed suicide themselves. The family could potentially feel guilt and regret for not supporting their dying relative enough. However, according to How Does Physician-Assisted Suicide Affect the Family, an article by the ConsumerReports.org, a group of 4 researchers, Linda Gunzini, MD, Elizabeth R. Goey, PhD, Stephen K. Dobzka, MD, and Holly Pregerson, PhD, ran a study on how assisted suicide affects family members. After interviewing families who had a relative die from assisted suicide and interviewing families who had a relative die of natural causes, researchers came to the conclusion that the family may not suffer as much as people think. The data states that for families who had a relative die through assisted suicide, 11% of families interviewed suffered from some form of depression. 2% of families had symptoms of grief. After interviewing families that had relatives die of natural causes, the researchers discovered similar results. Families that had relatives die through assisted suicide stated that they felt more prepared for their relative's death. The research goes on to say that families show more negative feelings if the relative requested assisted suicide but their wishes went unanswered. In conclusion, people who are seeking assisted suicide would be allowed to apply for assisted suicide, but physicians should first dissuade those who may be depressed. Then the next focus should be to make sure that the patient and their family knows all the options. If a patient is truly suffering, be it from pain or loneliness in their condition, their family and need to come to terms with the patient's inevitable death, something that is the exact opposite of what we as humans want to do. Chances are more likely that the family will be more supportive of easing the patient's death than watching them suffer or rot away. With changes in society and law, fewer people will suffer in pain and loneliness, and fewer families will have to go through the torture of watching their relatives' condition get progressively worse until the day that their lives are finally taken.